Okay, so I'm going to talk about how the British prevented China from becoming Christian amidst the deadliest civil war in all of human history. So it's just going to be a pretty quick run through. It's such a dense series of events. I'm going to focus mainly on some of the characters and some of the key events that happened. But before I get into the actual Taiping Civil War, I thought I might lay some of the groundwork in the context of the time. So the time is around 1850 in China, and the rulers are these Manchus, which are an ethnic minority in China. And here you can see on the left is a guy named Prince Gong, who's the brother of Prince Xianfeng, who is the emperor. And there's a pretty funny anecdote for how the emperor was chosen. So apparently in the Daoguang emperor, who was their father, when he was aging, he was trying to consider which of his two sons he would choose. So Xianfeng was the older one and Prince Gong was the younger one, but it wasn't automatic that the emperor would always go to the oldest son. So he asks them, he says, "What do you plan to do as soon as you ascend to the throne?" Prince Gong had a series of detailed policy initiatives which he had thought through carefully. And he talked about reforming the existing court system and changing the imperial examinations. When Prince Xianfeng heard this, he threw himself on the ground and wept, because becoming an emperor would mean that his father was dead. The father, of course, this being like a Confucian culture, announced that the elder son was the filial one, and the younger one was just talented. So he made the elder his imperial heir, and the younger became a lifelong prince, as Prince Gong. So, okay, these are the ruling members of the Qing dynasty, the two most powerful people. The other context of the time is the Opium Wars had just happened, and it's a whole fascinating saga too, but I'll just briefly say that from around, for a couple of years and ending 1842, the British got a large portion of the Chinese population addicted to opium, like literally the base ingredients of heroin. And when the Qing Empire attempted to outlaw and really cut down on the imports of opium, the British launched a war, and they won. And that's how the British got Hong Kong. They won the war against the Chinese, and yeah, they got control of Hong Kong as a city. So this also situates China as like it places the Qing in relative decline. It's a huge shame for the pride and the prestige of the empire. So there's a general feeling of weakness and vulnerability to the West. And the other thing I might point out is that, unlike something that's pretty unique, as far as I can tell, in Chinese culture, is the sense that dynasties changed really often. So here you can see all of the dynasties in China. So there wasn't the difference here between the Chinese population and the West, I think, is this feeling that dynastic shift was inevitable. And so there was just a sense that the rulers, they had the mandate of heaven, and eventually there would be some kind of overturn, but no one thought that any dynasty was going to last forever. So, and then the last thing that's pretty interesting that I'll point out is the hairstyles of the time. So you can see this is the Qing hairstyle. They before the Ming, they had their hair tied up, and then in the Qing dynasty they shaved their head and they had this long tail. And here's some pictures of, I think these are Manchu. These are Manchu like peasants, and yeah, it became, as I'll point out later, it became a really interesting point of distinction, because if you were a follower of the Qing, you had to have hair like this. But if you were a member of another group or of the Taiping, you would grow your hair out fully and it would look more like that or that. Cool. So let's start the story. Let's start the clock on the Taiping Civil War. it begins with a vision, specifically the vision of a man named Hong Xiuquan. So Hong Xiuquan, this is not exactly what he looks like. There's actually no surviving photos of any of the Taiping because they were all burned. But Hong Xiuquan is a prodigy in his village. So it's him and his younger brother are in a southern village in China, and he is educated partly by the Christian missionaries that are around. But everyone knows from a very early age that Hong Xiuquan is brilliant. There's this anecdote where he's said to be able to memorize the 4大本, which are like the 4 great works of Chinese, and the 5 classics, and he could just read and recite Confucian texts from like at the snap of a finger. So his family put an immense amount of pressure and expectation on Hong Xiuquan. The dream for them was for him to go to the imperial court and receive all of the money and allow their family to get out of the debt that they'd amassed in trying to educate their son. And so he's really brilliant, and he does the first round of Chinese imperial examinations and gets through them, and he travels to the next region. And at first he's doing pretty well, but gradually falls in the rankings and he doesn't make it. So this is when he's 19. He does this again and again for the next 10 years or so. And after failing the examination for the 3rd time, he's so stressed out that he just collapses. And I'll read from an excerpt here. So Hong Xiuquan had his first visions in 1837, just after failing the examination for a 3rd time. So at this point, he'd been literally 10 years or 15, 16 years of his life was just preparing for this one examination. So he failed the examination for the 3rd time. Weakened by the ordeal, he had to be carried home afterwards. When he got there, he collapsed into a bed and called his family, who crowded around him. He apologized to them that his life was over and he had let them down. Then he closed his eyes and lost all strength. They thought that he was dead. But eventually he woke up and began telling them about strange things he had seen when he was asleep. In his dream, a dragon, a tiger, and a cock had entered the room, followed by musicians with a sedan chair. They carried him away to a beautiful and luminous place full of men and women who rejoiced. He was escorted into a grand hall where in the highest position sat an old man with a black robe, with a flowing beard of gold. The old man wept that the people of the world did not venerate him. They take my gifts, he told Hong Xiuquan, and therewith worship demons. They purposefully rebel against me and arouse my anger. Do not thou imitate them. He then gave Hong Xiuquan a sword for killing demons, but admonished him not to use it on his brothers and sisters, as well as a seal and a piece of yellow fruit, which he ate. So in 1837, he has these visions, and he doesn't quite know what to make of them yet. There had been some contact with the Christian missionaries, but he hadn't really known about the doctrines of Christianity at the time. A few years later, he comes across a pamphlet that a missionary gives him, and he begins reading it very seriously. And at this moment, he has an epiphany. Hong Xiuquan is reading this pamphlet, and he realizes, actually, all those visions were about Christ, and God was the old man in the flowing robes, and furthermore, he was the brother of Jesus Christ. So the Holy Trinity, usually the God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, is God, Jesus, and Hong Xiuquan. So he begins preaching really compellingly. And his brother, Hong Rengan, the younger one, slightly less talented, is one of the first converts. And Hong Rengan is going to come to play a pretty important role later. So 1850, fast forward like a few more years after he has this epiphany, he's amassed tens of thousands of followers. And in the south of China, there is an uprising. So where he is from, so Hong Rengan, or Hong Xiuquan, is roughly from this region of China. And there is a rebellion against, or an uprising against some local officials who try to put down the Taiping worshipping the Christians. And he just gains from there, they overthrow the local officials, and he just gains this like wrecking ball momentum. He's finding it so easy to just recruit people who goes to the villages. And at the time, I might also have mentioned the Qing are really not popular. They are seen, the Manchus, being an ethnic minority, are seen as really different from the Han majority. And the Han, like a lot of the peasants and the urban working class, were being heavily taxed at the same time as there was like a lot of local corruption. And so just by going from village to village, Hong Rengan could just have tens and thousands of young men just join him and in his vision of reinventing China. And one of the things that actually later becomes a point of focus for like current day China is that Hong Rengan's vision includes communal land ownership. So there's this aspect of the seed of communism there. But anyways, he's going around to all these villages, and he has tens of thousands of people. And the Qing at this point, they're somewhat weak and pretty corrupt. There's a lot of internal factions that are fighting against each other. The Manchu armies, for example, were separate from the Han armies, and the Manchus, being an ethnic minority, are much smaller, and these armies are not able to work together. And so by 1853, he has 500,000 men, and they all go, and they basically just march into Nanjing, this really culturally important city, and they take it over. They take it over, they take all of the Manchus inside and cut their heads off. And they take the Manchu women outside and set them on fire. And that, I think, the first invasion of Nanjing is seen as, historically, it's one of the more brutal acts of war by the Taiping. Typically, they were known later to be much more like friendly and not violent towards the people of the cities that they would take over. But anyways, they take over Nanjing and kill all these people, and yeah, Hong Rengan is gathering all of these people, so he starts delegating, because he can't alone rule the entirety of China. So he starts delegating these kings. There's the Eastern King, there's the Brave King, there's the Loyal King, there's the Wing King. All of them have their own armies, and they all go out, and they hatch this master plan to take over all of China. And so at the same time, I mentioned Hong Rengan. Hong Rengan is separate from his brother. While he had been campaigning, Hong Rengan had been volunteering with missionaries, and Hong Rengan was going all around like Shanghai and various parts of the coast of China and learning and volunteering and preaching. He's actually a very serious missionary himself. So he's going out and talking to all of these missionaries, and it's at this point he starts to have these visions for Taiping. He thinks that Taiping should be modernized. He wants railroads like the West. He wants schools, hospitals, newspapers. He wants trading ports to widely open so that technology can become imported and China can become modernized. And above all else, he wants it to be a Protestant Christian empire. He, instead of Confucius, he wants to turn over the entire imperial system. So when you do the tests to become a member of the imperial court, rather than asking about the Confucian teachings, it's going to be about like the Bible, and specifically Hong Rengan's interpretation of the Bible. So he goes on a series of crazy adventures and manages finally to connect back with his brother Hong Rengan in around 1859. And yeah, at this point he has his visions, and Hong Rengan promotes him to the Shield King, which is second only to himself. So at this time it's looking pretty bad for the Qing. They just had this really important city taken from them, and in terms of numbers, the Qing army was actually absolutely smaller than the Taiping's. But they had one hope, and that was a man named Zeng Guofan. This is a picture of Zeng Guofan. So Zeng Guofan was a Han Chinese official from Hunan who was loyal to the Qing because his whole career he had managed to pass the examinations. He'd been treated quite well from the Qing. So all of the Qing armies were getting demolished by Hong Rengan and the Taipings, except for Zeng Guofan. And he had his loyal Hunanese army that was holed up in like the middle of China, around like slightly south of, let's see, Anqing. Yeah, China's very big. But so anyways, so Zeng Guofan is like one little stronghold, and he's like the only hope for the Qing dynasty. But at this point, I haven't even mentioned the British. So at the same time as all of this craziness is happening in China, there are these Taipings taking over. The British are panicking. And the British are panicking because they are afraid their economy is going to collapse. You see, their two biggest trading partners are China and this little former colony of theirs called the United States of America. And China, for them, was their major source of income because of opium, but also tea and silk. And the United States, especially the South, was the source of all of their cotton. And so by around the late 1850s, there had been this cotton starvation, this cotton famine is what they called it. And it was looking very dire for a lot of the parts of the British economy. And so there were massive debates in the parliament at the time. Some argued for supporting the US South against the North so that the cotton industry could be overthrown. And just like, it's very crazy to imagine at the time. Non-trivial British support for the US South. And this was a hope of many of the Confederate states that the British would come in and prop them up against the North. And some people were supporting the South. Other people were supporting the Qing. And Hong Rengan had been talking to some missionaries who went back to the UK and were spreading some good feelings about the Taipings. But that was by far the minority. Because even though some heard about this supposed Christianity from Taiping, the most influential British person was this man here by the name of Frederick Bruce. And Frederick Bruce was kind of a proper English gentleman, and he thought there were these notions of like the proprietary of the empire. The empire is what, like, you can't challenge the state of the empire. That has to be upheld. Like, you can't support rebellions. And so he just had this hatred of the Taiping. He had heard accounts of how barbaric they were with like the Nanking or Nanjing initial invasion, and disregarded many of the other instances where they treated foreigners really well, and just continued to send these little blue books back to the British Parliament. And he was just saying, Taiping are barbaric. We cannot support the Taiping. It's not a proper group of it's not a proper movement. Like, we shouldn't recognize its legitimacy. And so, despite the supporters of the Taiping, the Prime Minister at the time, Palmerston, was persuaded by Frederick Bruce. And so the British were hugely economically motivated, but they also had a sense of dignity and honor about what they could and couldn't do. And so basically everyone agreed that they couldn't have another India. There were some people saying like, oh, what if Britain just took over China, because it's now our duty. They were ashamed actually from the Opium Wars. The Opium Wars were pretty unpopular in Britain, even though they had happened at the time. So they were saying, we have blood on our hands, and maybe we should take over China and make it right. But that was by far the minority dissenting perspective. And so what ended up happening was the official decree of Britain was that they had to be neutral. You're not allowed to take sides in China officially. But because Palmerston was swayed by Frederick Bruce, he allowed Frederick Bruce to interpret what neutrality meant. And in practice, the way that Frederick Bruce was able to work out a way to send this like British militia to China, and his defense was that there are a lot of British foreigners in Shanghai, and the British army had to defend interests of the foreigners. But of course, I mean, it would still be technically neutral if the foreign merchants were able to go about and support some of the repression to like preemptively quell the threats around the region. So this army around Shanghai, which was supposed to be neutral, it was called the Ever Victorious Army, basically taught the Qing and equipped the Qing with weapons and allowed the Qing to move their soldiers upriver and started to attack the Taiping. And in a series of battles that were actually kind of pretty influential, they quenched resistance in the villages around the capital of Nanjing. And so this British Ever Victorious Army didn't actually end up taking down Nanjing, but they laid the groundwork. And at this time, if we go back to Hong Rengan, the Taiping is facing some internal turmoil. There's a bunch of crazy stuff that's happening. So there's this internal attempted coup where I don't remember if it's the Wing King, one of the kings attempts to, I think it's the Eastern King actually. The Eastern King, Hong Rengan disappears for a little bit. The subjects under the Eastern King bring him out and just stab him to death and cut his head off. And there's this infighting between the generals, and it's somewhat taken under control, but it leaves the Taiping with a bit of like turmoil. They're not as smooth as they were before. And there's also this resentment of his brother. So Hong Rengan had come in from not being part of the Taiping movement to being suddenly so powerful. There was just people resisting his movements, and he's getting demoted. He's originally in charge of foreign affairs, and then is now just basically becomes in charge of Heng Shuquan's son, which is still a really important duty. But anyways, the ever victorious army starts to attack the region around Nanjing, and then a bunch of crazy stuff happens, and it's like, this is maybe the most dense period of the war. I'm just going to go through quick bullet point by bullet point. Zeng Guofan, who I mentioned before, manages to amass a powerful enough Hunanese army by totally reimagining how military recruitment should work. After the British ever victorious army destroys a lot of the resistance in the region around Nanjing, Zeng Guofan manages to take back some crucial cities and eventually take down Nanjing. As he's besieging Nanjing, the Heavenly King, Hong Rengan, dies because of a infection. It's unclear if it's cholera or whatever, but there's some type of disease that he dies as the siege is happening. At the same time, there's this cholera outbreak that happens in Shanghai that spreads through a bunch of China that kills like 10% of the population. And the crazy thing, right before all of this is happening, Emperor Xianfeng, this guy, dies, and Prince Gong is left in charge. But technically, the emperor is now his 5-year-old son. See, he had like 20 concubines and had attempted to have children, but he was only able to have a single boy. And so there's a 5-year-old son that's technically the emperor, and they're all in hiding. But Zeng Guofan is able to take down Nanjing and destroy the Taipings. So the Taiping there either kill themselves or are beheaded, brutally massacred, and the British are kind of repentant. They see that their army helped the Qing, but the Qing really saw the British as like merchants, or just like, what's the right word? Soldiers for hire.
Mercenaries.
Yeah, mercenaries. And so the British are pretty repentant. And so the Heavenly King dies, the Taiping is dissolving. At the end, this is like the final situation. Basically everyone is distraught. Everything is sad. So Hong Rengan ends up fleeing Nanjing with the son of Hong Rengan. And he's like, I have to take care of my brother's son. This is the most important thing. So he has a bunch of really trusted soldiers with him and horses. He sends the majority of them to accompany the son into fleeing, like into hiding in the mountains. And he takes like 2 horses and rides to a local village. the Qing are out just hunting for Hong Rengan and the emperor's son, or the heavenly king's son. Hong Rengan ends up just going and hiding out in village to village. Some villagers who are opportunistic tell the Qing that Hong Rengan is here. So the last that is ever recorded of Hong Rengan is him sleeping near a fire, being ambushed by the Qing soldiers, him just running barefoot through the woods towards a rock face, and the trees are surrounding him, so he's just like grouped on all sides by the Qing. And I mean, the heavenly king is dead from this disease, the emperor is dead, the son of the Qing emperor is 5 years old and effectively ruled by his mother, the Empress Dowager. And even Zeng Guofan, maybe you might call it the hero from the perspective of the Qing of the war, he dies 6 years later, unhappy, because by the end of the war he is the most powerful man in all of China, and many people, even his brother, is encouraging him to actually use his military power and like take over China and rule it for himself. But he doesn't want that. He never was a military person to begin with, and he was much more of a scholar, and so he just steps down and abdicates all of the military might, and he professes it to the new emperor. But the people in the court are bickering, and they don't trust Zeng Guofan, and so they don't ever officially grant him even like a long period of rest that he requests after the war. And so he's just stressed, and you see his like writings at the end of the war, and he's depressed and regretful that his life had to be like this. Yeah, and then the British, of course, the war having ended, the trade, they had thought that trade with the Qing would prop up the British economy, but the war ended, and trade with trade with China significantly declined, and the British are in a period of pretty bad trade with China. So yeah, in the end, everyone loses, and it's just the final toll is 20. It's somewhere, their estimates ranging from 20 to 60 million people, all in all, killed in these series of fights between the Taiping and the Qing dynasty. Yeah, these were pretty hastily thrown together slides, but I guess the takeaway that I have from paying attention to this period is one, just a sense of how hard life was back then, to be like trapped in a city that you didn't know it was going to change hands multiple times within your lifetime, and you just were totally helpless. You couldn't go and farm the land around you, so it was like really common to just kill yourself as like a compassionate thing. The other thing that this gives me is the sense of how contingent all of history is, because there were many moments where the Qing could have gone north and decided to go north directly into Beijing and could have destroyed Zeng Guofan, but ended up not, just because the weather had been bad that day or something. And also the communication and intelligence aspect, because the British didn't really have a sense of how the Qing compared to the Taiping. They had this projection of the Qing as like the equivalent of the British Empire, and so they didn't even think, there was not like real serious consideration that any support, certainly not military support, could be given to the Taiping. So yeah, in this war everything ends badly. Yeah, that's it.
Nice.
Yeah, discussion points. Any thoughts or questions?
Yeah. So how are the Taiping armies organized? they were like in some uprisings, in like peasant uprisings, you get like very like because the conditions are right for it. It's easy to like amass a lot of troops
Yeah.
and to recruit a lot of
Right.
people to your cause, but oftentimes they're not like loyal soldiers. They're not necessarily loyal to the cause,
Yeah.
and oftentimes they're kind of lured into the army in exchange for like a meal or a piece of bread because they're starving.
Yeah.
And then like as soon as they invade a city, they just turn to looting
Yep.
and pillaging, and then so you can gather huge numbers very quickly, but then it degenerates very quickly too. And that's kind of what I'd assumed the Taiping movement was like, just because of the death toll.
Yeah, so I think it was a lot like that. So there's a lot of feudal land, feudal like warlords, and then they become like the kings under Hong Rengan. But the accounts that I read that Stephen Platt gives in this book. Oh, and I should mention that all of this is based off of or inspired by this book by Stephen Platt, Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom, which is a record of this period. Fantastic book. But anyways, the accounts that he gives are that the Heavenly King is actually extremely harsh with punishments. And so he decrees, for example, when they go into cities where they're foreigners, he says that anyone seen mistreating a foreigner is going to be beheaded, and their head is going to be parried around. And that actually happens. So in general, what the description is, wherever Hong Rengan is, there is like maybe like an inverse square rule, or just like where further away from Hong Rengan, the worse the banditry and the looting is. But wherever Hong Rengan is and his like central kings, the troops are actually somewhat well behaved. But the same wasn't true of the Qing. So the Qing armies were a lot of people initially that were kind of soldiers for pay, and they would just loot things really heavily. But Zeng Guofan, this dude, his innovation, one of his biggest innovations, was realizing that system was fundamentally untenable. And so he said, instead we need to have like people that are fathers of each military unit, and you have to be loyal to only recruit in network. You pay people very well, but you don't just like go from place to place. You have to recruit someone that you know, and they have to like pledge their fealty to their local leader, and their local leader has to pledge their like loyalty to me. So, yeah. One crazy thing that I didn't mention before is that the British, in an initial response to the Qing, ended up invading the Chinese capital at the time, and they set fire to the palace where the Qing emperor was, and all the British soldiers and the French, apparently the French. So there was also French and Americans, but mainly it was British, a little bit of French. They looted the palace, one of the great, you might call it like one of the wonders of the world. And Victor Hugo ends up like writing just a ton of letters, just lambasting the British government for allowing this to happen. Yeah, and it starts because the Qing kill some of the foreign correspondents in British correspondents in China. But yeah, the British are also they're looting China too.
Is that when they destroyed the biggest encyclopedia that have ever been written?
That might well have been. I don't know.
The British did that at some point.
Yeah.
Or they looted it and then lost it.
Yeah. 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 Any reflections, Anna? Was this surprising? Had you known about any of this?
I feel like that's what surprised me, is that like I've like read about this period and I have not heard about this.
You've read about this period.
Or like in Chinese history and stuff, like this period is taught, but the emphasis is on like very different things. Like I feel like the emphasis is on the opium war and like the looting of the palace and like
Right.
like this rebellion is like not really taught, or maybe I just didn't remember it as well.
Yeah, my
It's
sense is
really
that it is
interesting.
just generally very neglected. I
Yeah.
never even heard of this 2
Yeah.
months ago. So,
It's like it's such a big event, like so many people died.
yeah. I think
But
it's
I had heard of this guy though.
Zeng Guofan. Yeah, he's
Yeah.
supposed to be like a national hero.
Yeah.
But many people see him as like the greatest traitor of I guess especially people who are anti-Manchu. They're like, he's the greatest traitor to general, it's a weird period of history. It's like, how do you fit it into the current narrative of China? Like, because like it was an ethnic minority that was like clearly kind of corrupt and crumbling, and then there's this Christian uprising. Like, it's just kind of it's very strange and hard to like incorporate into a national myth. And one crazy thing I didn't even mention was that there were a bunch of uprising, like Muslim uprising around Xinjiang at the time that were significant, but those weren't part of Hongshuquan's. Yeah, it wasn't. They weren't part of the Taiping.
But did the Qing? I mean, nominally the Qing had like the greatest area of any empire, right? Like they controlled the greatest territory. But like from what I understand, around the Opium Wars and later, they basically didn't have control of like the whole of the Western Front. They didn't really control Xinjiang, and they didn't really control the South either. Like the
which is why this could happen.
Right.
Yeah, and then the Western Front was where the Muslim rebellions were. Those were eventually put down by Zeng Guofan after the Taiping Civil War.
Right. So they did gain back control of like the whole territory or most of the territory.
Yes, the Qing did. Before like crumbling later with this movement that was so there's an interesting thing of like there's a feeling among historians and among myself too that what the British did was they just delayed the inevitable. The Qing was like meant to collapse around here, but they propped it up for longer, and then the collapse became much more like it became much worse in terms of the like remaining infrastructure for the new empire. So then you have this like really prolonged period of like the Chinese nationalists, like the Chiang Kai-shek, and then Mao Zedong, and all of this like World War I to World War II turmoil. Yeah. And this had also a bunch of interesting ramifications worldwide. Like the Japanese were paying close attention to the Opium Wars, and like one fascinating tidbit is that the Meiji Restoration, which happened in Japan in 1870, after the U.S. gunboats showed up and were like, start trading with us, the Japanese didn't want to fight back because they saw what happened when like the Asians opposed the West, or the East opposed the West, and so they opened up, and then there was this period of crazy flourishing in terms of art, technology, economic growth, and plausibly that could have happened in China. So like you could imagine if the situation or the communication had been different between Frederick Bruce, the Chinese would have had a Christian country that would have been modernized thoroughly, and they probably would have developed much more rapidly. Yeah, it's kind of like unimaginable how different it would be.
So you think if like the Taiping Rebellion had been successful in establishing a strong empire, and you think it's possible, then it would have changed everything in that like China wouldn't have been invaded by
the Japanese,
and it wouldn't have like really had a communist revolution.
I mean it's incredibly hard to say. So the Japanese invasion of China was itself a really kind of random or a very contingent event. Even though the Japanese had troops in Manchuria, it was like if you read about the Marco Polo Bridge incident, it was really like a breakdown of communication between the Chinese and the Japanese generals. And so that itself feels like super contingent and very, very plausible that the Japanese wouldn't have gone into China if this is. But on the other hand, you could say like the Heavenly King it's not clear at all that he would have been able to consolidate the power. Maybe China would have collapsed under the Heavenly King, and there just would have been like prolonged internal fighting among the warlords. It's pretty hard to say, but it would have been dramatically different. Yeah. Wait, was that your question? Your question was how? Oh yeah, communist revolution.
I guess the counterfactual.
Yeah. 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 I think that was it. There's one little last thought.
So like British play a pivotal role? Like without the British, would the outcome have been completely different?
It seems like they did play a pretty important role. They weren't like you can't say it was just the British, but according to Stephen Platt at least, like without British support, the Qing wouldn't have been able to ferry troops up to defend like Shanghai really well. And it seems like, I don't know the exact details, but the quelling of the rebellions around Nanjing was really quite important for Zeng Guofan to come in and disperse the Taiping. Oh yeah, the last note that I wanted to add was, it's usually referred to as the Taiping Rebellion, right? But the Taiping Rebellion is the term, but what Stephen Platt chooses to do, and which makes sense to me, is he calls it the Taiping Civil War, because the rebellion framing takes the Qing side. So like from the perspective of the Qing, it's a rebellion because we're the proper people. Like we are the empire that belongs on top. So you are the rebels. But if you look at it from like the perspective of a median person in China who did not like the Qing, you would see it as like, this was my side. Like this was a legitimate kingdom that was established, and Hong Chen has established the land, and there was a proper, like any way you want to call a country, that those properties would apply to Hong Chen. There was a kingdom there, so you should call it a civil war. Yeah.
And also, I'm curious if there's any sense that, because Chiang Kai-shek was also Christian, and he was converted by his wife.
Yeah, so this uprising event was super influential for the Chinese nationalists. Sun Yat-sen, his nickname was Hong Chen. His like friends would call him that, apparently. So, but I don't actually know that much about the period of when the Qing finally fell. So I can't say, but I know that it was supposed to be quite influential. But yeah, okay. Well, you want to do your talk, so let's.
Sure. I mean, I didn't prepare anything quite so.
That doesn't matter. Yeah.
I basically have a few images and no real coherent story.
Cool. Thank you for listening.
Sure.
Oh, we should pause the video, or actually we should keep it going.
Also, I feel like rebellion in Chinese is like a much more positive word than